We need to consider how to re-engineer things that have become almost set in stone.
This is Ed Clay on the Big Idea Podcast. We have Dr. Michael Leibman today. Dr. Leibman has a PhD in theoretical chemistry and protein crystallography on, I believe, 14 scientific advisory boards.
Yeah.
An expert, one of the world's leading experts on clinical trials, and just a really interesting person. Michael, thanks for being on.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so what have you been up to? What's been going on?
Well, we've got something big that we've been starting. It's sort of mushrooming, and I think it will has a lot of power behind it. I've been involved with a disease foundation, a rare disease foundation, a pediatric rare disease foundation. It's called the Nathaniel Adamczyk Foundation. And parents lost a child to a condition called pediatric ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. That happens frequently in adults, but in children it's very severe. And it actually has an extremely high mortality rate and is very hard to diagnose and very hard to manage because it's very heterogeneous. And the parents had started a foundation to try to figure out how to identify risk factors so that other families would not have to go through what they went through. Because basically their child became ill on a Friday, looked like they had a cold. By Monday they were in the ICU, and then it was on the order of a week before he had passed. And there really wasn't anything they could do. So I've been working with the foundation to try to come up with ways to foster research into risk evaluation and find out what risk factors might be able to be identified. And we've been working with a very large group of pediatric ICUs. But what you have to understand is when a child gets into the ICU, the physician isn't worried about risk, they're worried about keeping the patient alive. And so their emphasis is obviously well placed on keeping the patient alive and improving their care, but risk no longer matters because the patient's already ill. And as I've been working with these groups, there's about 120 of these PICUs, it became clear that the heterogeneity of the condition, which limits the ability to really manage it effectively, has to be better understood. And maybe we're looking, as they say, for our keys under the lamppost. Because we're looking at the child after he or she has been born to see what impacts there are that could be causing the disease risk. There isn't really an opportunity to look at genetics in it because there's no materials and so on to really explore. So it made me start to think that maybe what's happening is because the lung starts to undergo development in the fetus at about 10 weeks of age and continues primarily for several more months, but then continues to develop post-birth when the child is born and exposed to full oxygen or full atmosphere, that maybe risk is occurring much earlier in development and not as late as we've been looking. And so what I've done is to explore that. We've partnered with a group called GAPS out of Seattle, which is the Global Alliance to Prevent Prematurity and Stillbirth, which is another major problem. It's about 15 million incidents a year. And what they've done is to work on their problem. They've built an incredible documentation of pregnancy. And so what we're doing is working in collaboration with them to be able to map out what goes on during pregnancy in terms of exposures that the mother may be encountering, lifestyle, and clinical history. It could be atmospheric exposures, it could be exposure to infectious disease, or the use of certain medications or diet. And then mapping that to the stages of development of the lung in the fetus to start to see if we can identify at what point risks may be developing, and then can we identify biomarkers that would enable us to assess those risks very, very early and maybe intervene before they actually convert to disease. And so we've actually also started to partner with NIH because NIH has a program called the Human Placenta Project. And of course, the placenta is the transfer organ to convey things from the mother to the fetus and back. And so now what we're doing is looking at how to develop this, and we're actually extending it to try to look in, because it's a global alliance, in some of the other underdeveloped countries that they're involved in Asia and in Africa, to try to, where premature birth, premature death is a major cause of associated with neonatal and maternal deaths. So we're trying to see if we can do comparisons, actually provide potentially mobile health applications that could be used where you have lack of access to hospitals in a lot of rural areas, but you have individuals who all have cell phones. And because they have cell phones, can we actually use that technology to improve care, both to collect data for the analysis, but to provide clinical information back to the patient and help improve their situation as well?
Yeah. One of the things that it has impressed me about you is that you do use, I say, cutting edge technology like cell phones, being able to use your cell phone to, I don't know, diagnose sometimes, figure things out. Like, how did you get so on the cutting edge of, say, technology with medicine and analytics? Because you have it's a very interesting brain you have.
It's confused.
It's confused. You look at the abstract of the question. I remember that one.
Yeah.
But abstraction of the question. But no, how do you really put all of that together, working on the cutting edge like that?
Well, I don't know that I wouldn't say that I'm working on the cutting edge. What I would say is my focus is really on trying to identify what is the real problem. Because lots of people are really good, much, much better than I would ever be at developing technology. But after they develop the technology, they look for a problem to solve. And my goal is, let's figure out what the problems are, and then what's the mix of technology that will actually be well suited to address those problems.
So you say, let's figure out what the problem is. And that's really interesting to me because I would think that a lot of times, and I don't think that a lot of people may realize this, but I think a lot of times we're probably working on the wrong problem.
A lot of times, most of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah. In fact, I use, there's a quote that I sometimes use about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. It's a famous quote, actually, from Donald Rumsfeld. And I use it to reference that known unknowns are what we call unmet clinical needs. And we can always put together a whole list of unmet clinical needs. And that's what a lot of people focus on. But unknown unknowns are what I call unstated unmet clinical needs. And those are things that the physician won't necessarily even bring to the surface to discuss because they don't think there's a way to address them. And so they're not something that they spend a lot of time focused on. And that's what we work on very closely, working with clinicians to help identify what are those real foundational issues that if you solve them, they could have a much bigger impact. Not that the others don't have a major impact,
Right.
but that these actually can have a much more long-term impact and even cross-fertilize across different conditions, diseases, and so on, and even across technologies.
Gotcha. Yeah, the unknown unknowns.
Right.
And when you bring that up to the clinicians,
Yeah.
how do you help them figure out what those unknown unknowns are?
Well, that's taken a number of years to come up with the right formula for how to make that happen. And what I found is clinicians are very busy. They live in an operational world. They have things that they have to get done and ways to do it, and they're worried about efficiency, time management, and of course patient outcome and family and caretaker and the entire set of components of healthcare in that manner. But what they don't have time for is to constantly being questioned and challenged. And that's not the way that you actually can best help them. And so rather than coming in and trying to be at all confrontational, I understand and fully accept and appreciate that they operate on a day-to-day basis with their skill set, their experience, their knowledge, their colleagues, and input of many different parts. And that's how they have to operate on a day-to-day basis. But what I try to do is not tell them that I'm not there in any way to challenge that, but I'm there to see if there's ways that I can help them identify opportunities to make that go better. And it requires what I call a certain level of transparency, because there's a tendency not to be very transparent in how we do things. And especially when you have very skilled people in any field, they do it almost automatically and they don't expect to be questioned as to what or why they're doing it that way. And what I find is there's a lot of inadequate communication about how things happen in the real world, and assumptions that are made from those people who aren't trained. So in this case, the patients or their family or just people in general who make certain assumptions, and they're not actually the way things happen. And being comfortable and not being concerned that someone's questioning you why you're doing something differently, but you're trying to understand why so that you can try to help make improvements. That's one of the challenges that we've been able fairly successfully to try to overcome.
Wow. And so that company is called what? IPQ Analytics?
IPQ Analytics.
Okay.
Identify, prioritize, and quantify.
I see. When did you start that company?
We started that in 2012 with
Okay.
a colleague of mine, Torsten Geers, who used to be with Thomson Reuters.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about this, but I find it fascinating with the clinical trials. I've learned a lot in those discussions that, some clinical trials are just, a drug might not pass, not because it's a bad drug, but it's just a bad trial design. And then sometimes drugs might pass that might not be the best drug, but it's a great trial design. How does that actually work?
Well, you have to understand that there's a lot of competing activities and agenda, shall we say. Ideally, when a drug is developed, from a commercial perspective only, you'd like to have the biggest market possible. Clinically, you like to have the most effective drug that you can and the highest safety factors. And you sort of have competing interests in that, because to be most effective, it may be most effective, but only in a small population. And so frequently what happens is, as trials are developed and some of the strategies put in place, there's a tendency to try to be broader than what the real target community could be or should be. And we can make arguments that personalized medicine is trying to address that, and it is conceptually, but it personalized medicine as it's being applied tends to focus on genomics alone. And if you look at even documents from NIH, genomics is probably about a third of the factors involved in disease. Lifestyle and environment are significant contributors, and then clinical history as well. And so we really have to have a much broader profile of what is being incorporated to understand what a patient represents. And so to make the to optimize and help secure the probability that a drug will be shown to be effective, what you want to do is you want to minimize the other factors that might confound the behavior of the drug because the patient may have other conditions, may be taking other medications, may live in a certain environment, may have a certain family history, may have certain genomic or genetic factors active. And so you tend to try to make the trial, for purposes of success, narrow in that definition. That, of course, then has a problem because if you do succeed with the trial, that's not necessarily what the real world population looks like. And that's not necessarily what the patient looks like who's coming in the door. And yet, it was developed and approved because it was successful in the population in which it was tested. And that becomes one of the issues. We've just gotten a small grant, actually, and it's almost exactly in line with what you were just asking about, to look at MS drugs. So there's an enormous number of MS drugs. MS is a very difficult condition to basically manage and so on. It's a difficult condition to diagnose because, as with many of these complex conditions, diagnosis comes about by ruling out other conditions. So you go about ruling out conditions that you can test for and see what's left, and you come back to MS. So there's a number of conditions that may have similar presentation, and they have to be ruled out. What happens then is that in these trials, there's a large number of drugs that have never succeeded in trial. They failed. But then there are a number of drugs that have succeeded, but when they have gotten to the clinic, they're not successful because they're for a targeted population and not the overall population that's coming through the door. And so one of the things, because what we've done is build a model that is very comprehensive of the whole disease process, going from risk to symptoms to clinical diagnosis and procedures, treatment decisions, physician compliance, patient compliance, and then outcome. We're using that model to evaluate the trial protocols for the drugs that failed, as well as for the drugs that succeeded but failed in the clinic, to see if we can detect patterns of how these trials were established that set them up for failure.
Okay.
And are there lessons to be learned that we could apply in a more general way and improve the whole trial design procedures?
Right. Yeah. So, I don't think that most people, even clinicians, realize that some of these trials, some drugs should have passed, and some drugs shouldn't have been passed, or scientists for that matter. I mean, that's it. You think of especially a 3-phase FDA trial as the gold standard, and it's probably the best that there is that we have right now. But it's interesting that there's ways to really make it that process better, right? What could be done now for the betterment of all the trials throughout the United States, at least, to make the process even better, to where you don't have those factors per se?
Well, I'll tell you what my bias is.
Sure.
Okay. Many of the diseases, and MS is a good example, asthma, COPD, or diabetes even, are what we call complex disorders or syndromes. And what that basically means is there's a number of subtypes of those diseases.
Okay.
And that diagnosis is what we would call a basket diagnosis. Patients are put into that category, and diagnostic codes are assigned sometimes because they have to be assigned to justify reimbursement and procedures.
Okay.
And sometimes the procedure you want to do or the tests you want to run require a certain diagnostic code that may not be exactly representative of what the condition is,
Okay.
but it's close enough. Okay? And one of the issues that we tend to deal with is when we get into the trial, we're looking at criteria for diagnosis that may include clinical guidelines for diagnosis that come from the New York Heart Association or ASCO or any of these professional societies. But they tend to also have been developed based on randomized clinical trials.
Right.
So you sort of have a circular argument where you have a narrow group, certain information's coming out of that, you're aggregating that and building a clinical guideline that then self-perpetuates some of exactly what you just put into the system.
Right.
What we'd like to see is before you get to that stage, and maybe even as early as discovery, that more emphasis is put on understanding the disease and the subtypes of the disease,
Okay.
stratifying the disease, and understanding that the drugs that you're developing may work well for certain subtypes and not others. And then potentially when you recruit patients, better classifying them and looking at a greater use of adaptive clinical trials, where you've identified subgroups of patients and you are comparing their response, but you're seeing that in this group the drug worked really well, this group it didn't work very well at all, and this group had a so-so response.
Okay.
And that will improve the success, but again, what it goes against is the size of the market potentially at the end of the day. And so there's counterbalancing forces.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, this is getting into like a philosophical question, but this is interesting to me. Okay, so, someone that's not a scientist like me looks at the system and say, "There's something kind of messed up. There's something wrong. I don't know what it is. How do you fix this?" But so if you have like small subgroups of patients that have a better chance to respond to a specific drug, but it costs, let's say, I don't know how much, $500 million to $1 billion to get a drug through an FDA process, and 10 years, 15 years. How do we create an incentive for a pharmaceutical company or biopharmaceutical companies to actually focus on those subsets? Because it doesn't seem like, it doesn't seem like they would want to.
Well, again, it's an issue of logic versus culture, okay? To a certain extent, we've done things a certain way, and we're comfortable with that. What we're talking about is disrupting it to a certain extent, and disrupting it because if you do find subsets of patients by stratifying the disease before you start the trial process, you would then design a trial for a much smaller targeted population, which would be shorter to run and much more cost effective. In which case, and this is where the logic starts to run against the culture. We're used to thinking about drugs incurring value because they're blockbusters. But what you have to think of, it's sort of like a hill. The blockbuster is how high is the hill? Okay? Are you over a certain threshold? But the real question is, what's the integrated area under the entire revenue curve between the time it's approved and the time it goes off of patent? And rather than worry about the peak, if you can increase that total area, you've had a greater impact on revenue. You just haven't had something that fits into that category.
Sure.
So getting away from the labels, but understanding that you've actually had a more sustainable product life cycle is again, something that is a bit disruptive.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I look at the model, and what about the process taking so long? And this is coming from I'm at the very end of millennial, like 38 years old, but wanting instant, to fix things instantly. And of course, it's not going to be fixed instantly, but to me, the process is too long. How do we make this faster to where we can get these type of possibly life-saving treatments to people, faster? Because I was just having a conversation at SITSI with a guy, an oncologist, and nice guy, pretty righteous, but just stuck in an old ideology. It's just, this is just the way it has to be, and I'm very open-minded. Like, what are all the possibilities, and how do you really start changing minds and figure out a way to get it done faster without making other people wrong? How do we say, hey guys, it's okay, don't you kind of feel there's something wrong? I mean, so I'm asking, I guess, a few questions. One would, how do you get it done faster? And two, how do you bring everybody along without making everybody else wrong?
Well, that's part of the effort to use real-world data and real-world evidence. Try to take data that's already been collected, whether it's pharmacovigilance data or other associated data, and bring it to bear on the decision-making and integrate it with the data that's being collected. The thing, though, and I've seen this, so I have to make the comment on it. I've seen discussions on that there should be emphasis on making real-world data look like randomized clinical trial data. And that's not correct. Because what that does is it says we're worried about getting the trial done and getting regulatory approval. And we're looking for real-world data that will help support that. But the problem is that's not necessarily what all of the patients that are being treated look like. Mm-hmm. So what you really want is the real randomized clinical trial data to better approximate the real-world data.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay? And at the same time, one of the things I also see is that people are reaching out and trying to apply technologies. Mm-hmm. And I would have to say sort of looking at the problem from the perspective of we have technologies that handle a lot more data, whether it's what we call artificial intelligence or machine learning or deep learning. And they're trying to look for all the data they can possibly bring in. That has a problem because not all of the data is of equivalent quality. Mm-hmm. And not all the data really deserves or merits being integrated with each other data set. And in the search for a lot of data, a lot of that is being left behind. And so I think in the long run, it's defeating the purpose and can cause other issues. But what we need to do, again, and it's in the same vein of being more transparent, is understand how to better qualify the data that we're bringing in. Because if you bring in EHR data, electronic health record data, and you mingle it with claims data, as I just said, claims data is what you tell the insurance company the patient has. Mm-hmm. EHR data is what you record about the patient, and they're not always the same.
Right.
And there's a number of reasons why they're not necessarily the same.
Sure.
And so you can't just put those two together and come up with, an enormous, much larger data set that you can apply the tools to, because the tools aren't necessarily the driver. It's the problem that should be the driver.
Yeah, absolutely. Should be the problem.
Right.
We get to figure out how to reteach that too.
Well, it's and I'm on the faculty of some medical schools here and in China, and one of the things I've tried to get introduced, both to medical schools and to graduate schools, is a course in critical thinking. And I have a lot of resistance to that.
Really?
Yeah. People, especially medical schools, have tended to be focused on exams and a strict type of curriculum, without having the space to put something like that in. Mm-hmm. And yet we're expecting our clinicians to make critical decisions. and critical thinking, which is literally what a really good diagnostician does, is really important.
Yeah. So you talk about working in China at some at a medical school, or
Yeah.
working with medical school in China.
Fudan, yeah.
What's your experience been in China? Because you spent a lot of time out there. You got some good relationships, and you seem to really like it. What's it like over there with medicine and science?
Well, science has been pushed quite heavily in the last few couple of decades, and a lot of it has been driven by bringing back Chinese scientists who've come to the U.S. for education and training, and have gone back to help start up companies and so on. A lot of it is, of what I've observed, though, is it's technology oriented. So it's applying technology and not necessarily looking at more of this critical problem-solving issue. And to me, that's sort of an interesting conundrum, because Chinese philosophy tends to be Oriental philosophy tends to be much more holistic than what we have derived medicine from the West. That's been much more organized around organs and questions and so on. But the Chinese traditional medicine is, as an example, is geared at a much more holistic level, and so the push for technology almost goes orthogonal to that. And I think if they could more effectively try to tie them together, rather than sort of keep one going, but in the background while they push the technology side, I think they could actually make some advances that we might not be able to make.
Yeah, that's a novel idea. The fact that maybe some other stuff is right.
Yeah.
There's you throw the baby out with the bathwater, per se, doing it that way. But I mean, the traditional Chinese medicine. I mean, it's been around for, I don't know, thousands of years probably, and there's got to be some stuff in there.
The key is figuring out what is the stuff.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why do you think that? Okay, so that is a critical thinking tells us that. We're thinking that there's probably something there. If it's been used for so long, we might not know what it is.
Right.
But we should look at it.
Well, it's like aspirin came about because people were chewing on bark of a tree that basically had salicylic acid in it.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So why do you think it is that, because that's a very Western thing to say, no, that can't be. It's not.
It's a cult. It's I feel it's fundamentally a cultural perspective.
So how do we start? I always say, hey, I like to build bridges, not walls.
Yeah.
How do we build bridges with those type of thing, the Ayurvedic type medicines, to the things that definitely need to be studied more? We definitely need to figure those things out, but might not be mainstream, and up until probably recently, they're considered, I say, quackery, or it doesn't work, or throw it out.
Well, yeah, I think one of the problems you have, of course, is with a long history of applying Chinese traditional medicine. You also have the effects of that, and an example of that is I was working with a pharma group that was interested in looking at a drug for hepatitis B, which is a problem primarily in Asia. And one of the things that they didn't necessarily recognize was that a lot of the Chinese traditional medicine have a certain degree of liver toxicity, even though at a very low level, but it's a chronic exposure to liver toxins. And so livers would be a bit different in China.
Sure.
And again, that comes with thinking about the problem, being transparent, and
Yes.
understanding that. And so the response you might get would be very different than the response you would get in a Western situation.
It's a good example of that.
Yeah. Now, I think an area that is becoming more active in the West that might actually be able to provide some bridge is going into the metabolome. Because now you're talking about things that are affected by diet and things that are much more closely aligned with supplements and things of this nature. So I think as we go sort of deep into that, we may start to see, or that may provide some level of bridging into where some of the Chinese traditional medicine may have actually been acting.
Interesting. Yeah, it just seems that I would hate to lose that technology. There's got to be something there, and that would be an interesting way to do it. Now, speaking of diet, you're a vegan or vegetarian?
Vegetarian.
Vegetarian. How
Non-militant vegetarian.
For sure, not at all. But how did that come about?
My family had rampant high blood pressure, and I decided that one way to control it was to reduce meat. I never actually had a great loving for meat as I was growing up, although that was what I was fed basically every day.
Sure.
But if you ask my ex-wife, she said I did it to spite her family, who were meat lovers.
Oh gosh.
But it was a short but progressive transition from a totally open diet to a fish-oriented diet to vegetables.
Sure. Well, why do you think it is that, we know that obesity is a giant problem in the United States. Now it's acknowledged that obesity is a cause of cancer, can be a cause of cancer. Why do you think it is that medicine is so hesitant to focus on people's diet when it comes to just overall well-being in, let's say, different degenerative diseases, possibly cancer, possibly, heart disease obviously makes a difference. Why do you think there's such a hesitation?
I don't know that medicine has been reluctant to do it. I think I think what's shown up is people are reluctant to follow it.
Okay.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
So it's not uncommon to hear someone say, well, it's the only pleasure I have,
I see.
what I eat.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because I would say, like, for our patients, one of the issues that we deal with is patient compliance. A big issue that we deal with is patient compliance. So yeah, I guess it wouldn't be. It is. I mean, and we know how to fix. Generally, we know how to fix obesity. Hey, get on a good diet. Whatever that diet is. There's 1,000 diets out there.
For most people, that's how we would fix it. Right?
Sure. Yeah. So interesting. Patient compliance, and that is a good point, because I don't think that most people realize how hard it is for the clinicians to get patients to do what they say, per se.
Well, part of it is we've progressively, and the internet's part of the blame for this, we've progressively gotten to the point where we want instant return on the investment.
Sure.
And so, if I'm making a decision based on something, I want to see the result of that very quickly. Well, you don't get that with diet.
Right.
And so people get frustrated.
Right.
And people aren't necessarily as accepting as something that takes a bit longer with a commitment to change.
Sure. I wonder how many diseases, and I've seen like a meme or something online that's like, you want to fix this problem. It's like the doctor gives a prescription of diet, meditation, and exercise, and tell me how you feel in 3 months. Do this every day.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things out there that would be
There's
likely
no question that a lot of issues we have today have a relationship with diet and poor diets. But there's also a lot of other factors that tie into it. There's a lot of work we do with social determinants of health.
Oh, yeah.
So
Talk
you've
about
got
that.
socioeconomic factors, you have cultural factors, you have access to food. These things actually also have to be considered. It's not just, I want to create this diet and I can call Uber and have Uber deliver this every day. That's just not a practical solution.
Right. What do you think about all the like the GMO stuff in the foods and people? There's a lot of there's controversy behind it. What's your position on that?
My personal position is I'm not against GMO. But I think it needs, like everything else, to be studied and better understood and documented. We've been doing modification of genetics for so long in our food system
Sure.
that this is just another way of accelerating that process.
Sure.
And because we're accelerating it, we don't have the same comfort necessarily of all the safety features. And so we need to adapt our evaluation and validation procedures to
Yes.
accommodate that.
Here's my view, and it's somewhere along the lines of that. I try to eat organic as much as I possibly can. You think about all of the GMOs actually have saved people's lives around the world because they didn't have access
Right.
to that food.
Right.
You're able to grow better
Right.
and those type of things. And so, do I intuitively think that there's something going on that could be bad every now? Yes. Hence, I eat organic whenever
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
But do I think that do I think that we should just throw it all away? Absolutely not. So, and that's where I think that there's a balance. And a lot. If you look at everything, there's a lot that's so polarizing now. You got to either be, for instance, on the GMO thing, you either got to be pro GMO or anti. Like no,
Right.
like what? There's a reasonable position in a lot of these positions that are so polarizing right now.
Yeah.
I think there's a reasonable positions kind of in the middle where everybody's not wrong on each side. There's probably something in the middle, kind of like the Chinese medicine.
I think the again, for me, the correct approach is which foods should not be GMO and which foods should be GMO.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah, like that.
And not just all one or the other.
Sure.
There's certain benefits in certain foods. Those benefits may have to be evaluated to be personalized for certain, genomic factors
Sure.
or metabolome factors. I don't know that. I'm just saying.
Guessing, yeah.
But it's not just that they shouldn't be eaten by anybody.
Right.
We've taken away a lot of, we've evolved, so to speak, but taken away a lot of things that have been more natural by inserting technology and, different ways of life that have been extremely disruptive. I was just reading an article this morning on one of the news lines, and it had a very interesting topic because someone, and I forget the woman's name to give her credit, had done a map because, Earth and the sun, Earth revolves around the sun. The sun revolves around the center of the Milky Way galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That rotation around the galaxy takes about 250 million years. I think that's the approximate number. And what she actually did, and this is something that I think is an example of critical thinking, she mapped out over the 250 million years the evolution of life on the planet. And what she found is Earth was on the complete opposite side of the galaxy when the dinosaurs were alive. Okay.
That's interesting.
And
Huh.
see, I always try to use in some of the things I teach sometimes. We like to look at, say, you mentioned that I had done protein crystallography. We look at the protein structure and we try to analyze it. And when I would have students look at that and try to tell me everything about it, I would say, well, tell me which part is evolving away and which part have we evolved to? And they would look at me and they go, what do you mean? I said, well, why do you think this protein has stopped evolving? Because we haven't stopped evolving.
Right.
You're looking at a narrow time slice. And that time slice is so narrow even compared to how long, humans have existed in some form, okay, that we need to understand how those things have changed over time due to pressures.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
And we don't really appreciate time and the significance of time.
Yeah. Well, we almost know so little about time.
Well, yeah. But you know, I had was having a discussion today with a group that I work with on information on they're looking at Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. And I said one of the issues that we don't really understand, or it's complex, so we try to avoid it, is the fact that these two groups of patients look the same doesn't necessarily mean they have the same disease. They may have completely different diseases, but they happen to appear the same at a certain point in the progression of their disease. And that's based on what you're actually measuring.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't necessarily take that into consideration. A physician will tell you, if you ask them again, non-confrontationally, that's a problem they have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
These two patients may look identical, but they're completely different diseases.
Right.
It just happens at certain points in time they'll look identical.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Yeah, the whole, what you're talking about is a concept that, when I first met you, I was kind of wrapping my brain around it, and as we hang out more, we'll understand it more and more and more. You'll say. You'll tell me a story, and I'll hear it. I'm like, okay, I ask you the same question. I'll tell it, okay, I get it more and more. So I think it's one of those things that comes in scoops.
In scoops,
you know. So it's like, okay, digest it, and then go from there. But I wonder, how do we, and this is like solving the world's problems. So there's
right.
how do we get this type of information, because the clinical trial process is so important.
Yeah.
And we'll get into UCC and kind of what we're doing and some ideas. But the clinical trial process specifically is so important, and I feel like it can be changed and made better. But how do we get this type of logical information created by a lot of critical thinking to the masses, to where we can design better trials with, the subgroups and with the, because
the way it seems to work, because again, you've got different groups pulling in different directions, is you have to show the value for them to actually start to believe it, okay? And unfortunately, that is a long process. It's not something, because there's an acceptance of a general success rate in trials and performance characteristics and so on. That's sort of built into the system, okay? We know that this percentage of drugs will not succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know what the revenue is driven off that percentage that does succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so therefore, it's hard to change that ship in the middle of the ocean
Mm-hmm.
because everything has been structured around that. I always describe the drug development pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
as they call it. It's like a chain because each part of the pipeline has tended to be a silo, as they call them, although there's a little bit better communication nowadays. But if you take a chain with links and it's not pulled tight, you know that it can go in many different directions, okay? That's what we would call entropy, because it's not fixed to a single direction. What pharma has tended to do is when they get a new technology, they take that chain and they try to make it a bit tighter with the new technology, because the more you remove the randomness, the more efficient it becomes. And the more efficient it is, the less costly it is to drive certain steps of the process. And that's a lot of how they focused on extending drug development over the years. And so what happens is you bring a new technology in, and the very first thing the tendency is to line it up against the chain and see where it will have an impact, without ever thinking that maybe you should take the chain apart and put it back together again.
Yeah, that's a novel idea.
And then maybe you would do it differently.
Right.
If this technology had been available when you designed the process to start with.
Right. Yeah. Wow. It's complicated. It's complicated to fix.
Well, and as usual, it ends up with a lot of cultural issues.
Sure. Yeah. It is complicated. I do think that there's, you're an outside the box thinker, and there's outside the box thinking that maybe this problem will never be ultimately solved, but maybe it will. But it's going to take something like that to make it a lot better. And one of the things along the way, to me, is not making everybody wrong, because people are so invested in their idea.
Yeah.
And especially my experience of a lot of doctors, they're invested in an idea that it's got to be this way. And it's just like my dad. He's stuck in his ways. A great guy, stuck in his ways. He doesn't want to change. Like, well, I've been doing it this way forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would think that we've got to give it to them in scoops per se, and kind of show them that, hey, there is a better way. Yeah. So. Going on to like UCC, United Cancer Centers, you're our chief scientific officer, which is a great honor. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
It was awesome. Dr. Franco Marancola, who's both of our friends, he said, you got to meet this guy, and he's kind of like you guys, where he thinks outside the box, and whatever you said, you got to think of the abstraction of the question. It was like a light bulb popped off in my head. Like, oh yeah, that's amazing. That makes complete sense. But
I always tell people, I don't do rocket science. I just apply logic.
Yes. Well, it's like rocket science. I mean, you're applying a lot of logic, and you remind me in a way of some of my musician friends, in the sense that, for instance, one of my good friends is a guy named John Wesley Satterfield, one of our friends. Mm-hmm. And Satterfield he's able.
I think we met him.
Yes, you did. You met John.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So John, he's a brilliant poet, brilliant writer, and he also he writes songs as well. But he is able to put sometimes my thoughts into words where I'm not able to, because I'm not always able to explain what I'm thinking, and he's like, boom. And that is what I think you're able to do as well, is putting some thoughts that a lot of people are having problems explaining into words.
Well, I do a lot of things with analogies. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an analogy, because I mentioned the word complex disease, and I mentioned the word syndrome. Mm-hmm. So a syndrome fundamentally is that a clinical guideline says a patient has to have 5 of these 10 symptoms. Mm-hmm. But you can immediately imagine that 2 patients may not have the same 5 symptoms, but have the same syndrome, or classified that way. And that becomes a problem. It can become a problem because they may be at different stages of the disease and eventually look the same, but they may have different diseases. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Right.
And so that's why syndromes are complex to deal with. Mm-hmm. A complex disease is simply, as I said before, something that has subtypes. So to try to explain that to people, I have an analogy that I use. Mm-hmm. A complex disease is like having a tree, and each branch is a little different. Mm-hmm. A syndrome is like coming across several bundles of branches and assuming they all come from the same tree. Okay?
Gotcha.
And you see the difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is really good. And that is actually in many ways the definition of genius, like putting complex ideas in ways that everybody can understand it. I know you're humble, but that is what you do. That stood out to me. That stands out to me about you being able to do that. So thank you. Let's talk about UCC. So United
Yeah.
Cancer Centers is something that we're launching ASAP per se. So we're hoping around April time, launching United Cancer Centers. I've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, actually not a ton so far. But why don't you give people your perspective of what United Cancer Centers is?
Well, I believe what the concept is, and why I'm committed into it, is to really open up the way we understand what a patient's journey is and how to handle that patient's journey. Going necessarily only within certain boundaries, and being willing to be much more flexible in treating that entire patient. So it's a much more holistic concept. And getting into a holistic concept also, I believe that there's interest in recognizing and embracing that patient sits in a family, that patient may have caretakers, and even the family sits in a community. And these are all part of how a patient lives. And they're going to impact how a patient responds to treatment. And they're going to impact how a patient adheres to what they're told to do or recommended to do. And listening to a patient, even before you make a decision of how to treat them, can be very important. So I'll give you an example from I was at a number of years ago on something called the European Commission for the Quality of Life. And we had a retreat, and the psychiatrists had a session where they talked about all these quality of life measures, and they have these scales that they use and so on. And they were talking about how they would evaluate patients after they had been treated and reported on this. So I asked them a very simple question. I said, why do you wait to ask them about this after they're treated? Why don't you ask them about it before they're treated? And find out what's important to them and use that to help guide how you treat them.
Sure.
Right? It was kind of simple.
Right, yeah.
Because, and because I was the executive director of a breast center,
Sure.
the DoD breast center. So, basically what I said was, a woman, okay, she has the unfortunate reality that she has breast cancer. But if you ask her, these are some of the side effects of certain drugs, we have choices, what are high priorities to you? How important is it? How concerned are you about hair loss? How concerned are you about being able to continue working or take care of your children or, have certain activities? If you start to bring that into the equation of how you treat a patient and then make decisions based on, as much as possible, you can't be totally inclusive.
Sure.
But they help guide you to know, then the patient actually is much more responsive.
Sure. They know you care.
They know you care, and they know that you're trying to take these things into consideration.
Sure.
And that's going to contribute to their response to the treatment.
Yeah, I agree. That's really good because a lot of times people don't really consider that. Like this is, I'm going to say non-scientific, but human connection between people, patient and doctor, the patient trusting their doctor, the patient knowing that the doctor is listening to them, and taking into consideration what is important to them, I think is very underutilized. One of the things that we do at CHIPSA is all of our patients get hugs. I don't know if we can do that in the United States, but I hope so. All of them get hugs from the nurses,
Yeah.
from the doctors. And it's a very, very loving environment, very
Right.
much, human connection.
I had the experience when I was running the breast center of working with Nick Jacobs, who was head of the hospital and the research institute, and he brought in the plane tree philosophy, and that's where they bake bread every day, and they have musicians in the hallway, and they would let patients' families actually stay over, and they had basically therapy dogs that they would bring in. And not only did it have better patient response, it even dropped the infection rate,
Yeah, which is incredible.
which was totally against what anyone would have thought.
Sure.
And so these things are important.
Yeah, no, they absolutely are important. That's kind of one of the things that's I think is going to be different about UCC, as you were alluding to, is that, we do plan on taking all of that into consideration. Like,
Yeah.
what is best for the individual patient? Every patient that comes in there, how do we, make sure that they feel that they're being heard, they're listened to,
Right.
they're loved, that we actually care. Because that's what we hear a lot of, from
Yeah.
patients, is, oh, they don't really care. They just kind of push me to the side. And, I think that we, as in the world, can do better, and that's what,
Yeah.
what we plan on doing.
And then there's the need for, and part of that is what I referred to before, is a bit of transparency. I think it's important, although some people may disagree, for physicians to be willing to admit what they don't know,
Fair enough.
okay? Or what their level of confidence is. And it's not just the statistic, because you may have a statistic about how many patients responded, but the physician may have a different perspective of what that actually means. And sharing that is actually not typical in the way they're trained. And so building the hospital, the center, and incorporating that kind of transparency also goes towards building confidence in the patient and involving them. And it's absolutely patient-centric.
Sure. Now, let's talk about the relationship that we hope to have with the pharmaceutical companies,
Yeah.
the biotech companies, because, one thing that people may or may not understand about right to try, but the reality is the pharmaceutical company can say, hey, you know what, we're not going to give you this drug.
That's right.
And, you have to understand what the pharmaceutical companies are going through. They have a lot to lose, per se. And they have a fear. They don't know if the data is going to be collected. They don't know if how the information is going to be used.
I think there's a lot of reasons they have. They can't use the results for regulatory submission. They're not getting compensated other than at cost. So it becomes burdensome more than reward for them. But it's also an opportunity, and that's what we're trying to do with UCC, in making it something that actually can provide back to them value that they're not able to currently achieve in other mechanisms.
Sure.
And that is a much more comprehensive documentation of the entire patient. And that means the full understanding of diagnosis and treatments and lifestyle and environment and everything that is potentially involved in how the patient got there, and then what happens to the patient after they're being treated. And the opportunity, if by doing that from the start, being well documented, and actually working with pharma to build that relationship so that they see that the data that they would never normally be able to aggregate, it can be delivered and in a high quality manner, that's something that pharma respects.
Sure. And and ultimately we just got to deliver it. It
Yeah.
comes down to We're obviously confident, but we got to prove it, and fair enough. I mean, that's how the world works.
Yeah.
And I actually look forward to proving it and saying, hey, here's what you want with a bow tie, and this is here's the data, because
Yeah.
data is everything right now, and we're able to collect so much data. We're going to have a tumor bank. We're going to have
Right.
we'll be able to even go back and learn even more things in the future when new ideas come out. So
Yeah, and it's not just we're going to collect EHR data about the patient and you'll have access to the EHR. It's we're actually going to design the EHR to collect the data that will address questions that you have that you can't ask.
right, yes,
And so it's not just a simple EHR.
right.
It's an EHR directed towards really understanding the complexity of the patient and how care is being provided, and even how clinicians practice and make decisions.
Is it safe to say that if we achieve what we're hoping to achieve with the data, we're able to collect data that no one else is collecting?
That would be data that no one else is collecting.
Yeah, and so it's valuable. It's going to be valuable for the
Yeah.
pharmaceutical company, and a bigger goal. One of the big picture goals is if we give amazing data to them, they'll be able to really do something with it and create better clinical trials, which you're
Right.
passionate about.
Right. They'll be able to look at the data and see opportunities that they weren't able to necessarily see because of the structures that they have in place and the way you go about the process.
Right.
And that's where they get a benefit from it.
Yeah, and we have Inna working with us too, brilliant immunologist and I say data collector. She'll be the chief data processor. Obviously, Franco, Dr. Franco Marancola. He was chief of immunogenetics for the National Institute of Health.
Yeah.
And of course, you and Vijay Mahant. He did his postdoc, I believe, he did his postdoc at MD Anderson, co-founder of Autogenomics. So we've got a lot of data collectors with us that are all scientists, very, very esteemed scientists, understand research, understand why this is so important, understand the opportunity that we have to make a big difference. And, ultimately, when we do this, we make a giant impact. And I'm not really into proving people wrong to prove them wrong. I'm into making a difference, and I'm excited to. I'm excited to show them instead of proving
Yeah.
them. Hey, let us show you.
Yeah.
And let us, because that's ultimately building trust. This is a different idea that hasn't been done before. We are the first institution that's going to implement right to try. I think we have a very, very logical way to do it using precision medicine, whether it be using, well, they wouldn't be diagnostic tools, they'd be research tools, is I guess the right terminology, like liquid biopsy. I guess a diagnostic tool would be a tumor biopsy, that would be considered a diagnostic tool. But using diagnostic and research tools and kind of using common sense when you combine them all to make the best decisions you can for the patients.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense to me. It's like we don't have to be stuck on, the liquid biopsy is what's making the determination, because it's not.
Right.
It's something that we look at and we see what information that we can get to make a better decision overall. And, that is what is so exciting to me, because it really does, if we can do this at a specific level. We do take a process that would take 10 to 15 years with the FDA. In many ways, time collapse it into 12 to 18 months, meaning 10 to 15 years it could take a drug to get through a FDA clinical trial. 12 to 18 months is what generally takes something to go through phase 1. And if we're able to use drugs that have been through phase 1 and we're able to logically select the drugs for the patients based on all the diagnostic and research tools, and we're able to love the patients, and we're able to get them on a healthy diet, and we're able to offer them good psychological counseling, and we're able to just work on overall health, we have a good chance of making a big impact.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's very exciting. I get pumped up when I'm talking
Yeah.
about it. Get all fired up. And it's really an honor. I mean, really, I can't even say that enough, is that it's an honor to have people like you working with us, working together, because we couldn't do it. I mean, I'm an old fighter. What do I know about any of this stuff?
Well, but you need to be a fighter to make change.
Yeah.
You need to have persistence.
Yes. Well, we are fighters, and we have we have persistence, but no, it is great. We got to have people like you too, to help really build that bridge, and help to build a bridge to to make the change.
Yeah.
So, well, anything else? Close up here. Going to go to dinner here shortly.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say to the people listening to this?
No, I just think that we need to consider how to re-engineer things that have become almost set in stone. There's a lot of things I say sometimes, and that I think some people may take as being not just disruptive, but as criticism.
Mm-hmm.
But they're actually meant to try to be helpful.
Yeah.
They're really intended to be constructive, because not necessarily being trained in some of these areas, when I look at how things are being done, I may see things that you don't see when you're inside very deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will ask those questions, because I'm still the little kid that always asked why. and I still want to have an idea. And it's not to challenge you,
Mm-hmm.
it's to understand. And then see if there are ways that maybe we could think about it differently together and come up with better solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll keep asking those questions, and it's making a big difference. I'll put your bio up on the when we put the podcast out.
Okay.
And people can see, head of bioinformatics for Roche Pharmaceutical.
Global head.
Global head.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Professor in multiple colleges or medical schools, and like I said earlier, 13 or 14 scientific advisory boards.
Yeah, we're now into quantum computing.
You're now into quantum computing. I would say you're one of the world's leading experts in clinical trials and what makes them tick, and what makes some clinical trials fail and some clinical trials succeed. And that,
Well, we're working towards it.
yes, well, you're working towards it,
Yeah.
but give a lot of information through your experience and a long career in this, and it's exciting to see what you've created. It's exciting to see what you're going to create in the future, and we're excited to have you on the Big Idea Podcast.
Look forward to working together.
All right, thank you, Doc.